Okay, so we're here. I'm here, Alex, and we're here with Marco, and we're going to be chatting about the business report from the 2021 Business Studies HSC. Before we start looking at it, Marco, when you saw this business report question, were you like, what a great opportunity for students, or were you like, oh, I'm not sure about this one?
Look, when I first saw this one here was actually a pretty fair business report question. Actually, it was broad enough that it allowed students to really sort of talk about anything, really, particularly with the three questions they wanted you to answer in it. I've seen a lot through the years where they specify exactly what they want you to do, but I think this one here was quite broad enough that you can sort of bring in anything you wanted. The only thing I thought was a bit um, uh, specific, that if unfortunately business studies, this is something that I've had a gripe with for many years.
I
It's
know where you're
it's
going.
basically it's basically a memory test of your syllabus, really.
Yeah.
So if you already I know it's only small, like outline to operations influences, but if you've already forgotten where influences are or what goes in there, like that's one little dot point already sort of messed up a bit. Um, Mortgages, I think, is fine. New issue shares, I
Yeah.
think that would have thrown a few people if they didn't see it specifically as just shares, or like floating on the ASX, for example. I think the word new issue shares, if people weren't sort of specific enough in their study to remember where things were, I think that may have thrown them a little bit. But
Mm.
overall, I thought it was a pretty fair stimulus and a pretty fair set of questions.
Yeah, I agree. Why don't we go through the stimulus
Yeah,
and then we can get how we approach it? So, Aussie Baby Food have developed a trusted reputation in domestic and global markets due to their safe and sustainably sourced product range. If I was a student in this, I would be circling global
yeah,
markets, putting a little arrow and write globalization,
yeah,
right? That this is not just an Australian based business here. This has led to a significant increase in demand. What I like about this question next is saying, as a result, they're considering the purchase of a larger automated factory. And what I like about this is this idea that you've got more business, but in order to meet that demand, you're going to have to spend more money,
yeah,
right? So that in order to meet those sales, you are actually going to have to invest a substantial amount of money. And that also, I think that the case study here, that every word means something,
yeah.
right? So to also circle automated, right? You are doing away with people and choosing machines. This will lead to some job losses. I might circle that and write redundancies here. The business will require external finance to fund the factory purchase using either a mortgage or becoming a public company on the ASX. And I agree with you with that point about becoming a public company, new issue of shares. Because if I look at that last dot point, isn't it just debt versus equity, really,
That's
at the
basically
heart of
it.
that
Yeah,
dot point? Right.
that's it. Debt versus equity.
Because you're just saying you could borrow the money or you could sell shares.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the
And
thing as well that will not trip people up, but really sort of um, may may move people towards a mortgage. Like personally, I'd say using a mortgage for this scenario. I know it's only hypothetical, but I'd probably use a mortgage as opposed to floating and becoming a public company. Is that you've got Aussie Baby Food Pty Ltd, and a lot of people sort of skip over that
right.
without
Yeah,
realizing
yeah,
that
you're
that
right.
also shows you a lot about the fact that it's got a certain amount of staff. It's got a certain ownership structure that's going to have to change significantly. They're a private company at the moment, so they are still accessing equity, just in a
Yeah.
different way.
So
So
is that when you see PTY Ltd, does that signals to you, okay, so it's a limited liability private company that they haven't listed,
yeah,
that any shares they're issuing are as a private company and not as a publicly listed entity.
exactly. Yeah. So
Right.
obviously the scenario says they're looking at becoming a public company,
Yeah.
but for me, when I see proprietary limited, I'd say, well, look, if they've already got some private shareholders, it means they've already got some equity, which means that a mortgage should actually be the better option, because you're not going to dilute your ownership any more than it already is. you're not going to have any extra, voices at the table than you already do. And you've already shown the bank that you have the ability to, well, theoretically, be able to pay off your debt because you already have some
Right.
element of equity already.
No, I think that that's true. In terms of the two that I think that here it's clear that you have been hired by Ozzi Baby Food. In a separate video, we're going to look at a different business report where the audience is different
Yeah.
for the report. But here we're working for the company. Outline two operations influences affecting this business. You're like, okay, ops influences. Discuss the use of retraining and redundancy payments to help overcome employee resistance to these changes. Because you can imagine that employees would be upset if they're going to lose their jobs. And then, like you were doing there, compare the use of a mortgage to a new issue of shares to fund the factory purchase. Is there anything else, just in looking at the stimulus and the way it's set out, that you think students should really be like, focus on this or be aware of this in terms of approaching this?
Um, Nothing specific that sort of jumps out. I mean, you've touched on a lot of them, and a lot of them will come out later on when you start
Yeah,
writing your
that's right.
response. Anyway, a lot of it sort of will flow naturally when you sort of start making those links back. Anyway,
No, that's fair. Like where it says sustainably sourced product
yeah.
range, do you look at that and be like, okay, ethical CSR stuff like that? Or is it just kind of like this shows us the overall kind of approach of the company?
I think that you can make a very strong argument in your outline, your two operations influences. I
Mm.
think you can make a very strong argument that because they're safe and sustainably sourced, they're really hitting that ethical and corporately social responsibility. So, I can never get this one right. It's always an
Me
apple.
neither.
Corporate
I just
social
say
responsibility. Just
CSR, right?
CSR, not to be confused with the sugar packaging.
Not
Um,
at all. No.
um, so I think even though that's kind of like in the start, and
Yeah.
a lot of times students sort of see that very first line as just the context as opposed to actually giving you anything you can actually use in your response, because it doesn't actually, your first line is generally like, this is the business. The
Yeah.
second sentence is then when it starts to say, this is the problems they're facing, or this is what's going on. But I mean, if they're safe and sustainably sourced, one of the influences you can talk about is the fact that the only reason they've got a reputation is because they're safe. So without that,
Right.
then you wouldn't have an ability to have increased demand. You wouldn't have an ability to actually look
Sure.
into getting a new factory, really.
And that I think as well is that if you ignore that first line,
Mm,
you take away some arguments, because if you've got a trusted reputation domestically and globally, that's a really good signal that a bank would lend you money.
yeah,
Right, that if it said here that Aussie has a poor reputation in both markets, has question marks over sustainability, what bank is going to lend you money?
yeah, exactly.
So I think that each line, each word in these stimulus, I think we both know as teachers and setting exams that everything here has a purpose, and I think an opportunity for a student to actually discuss something of value.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the stimulus is written for a reason, but it's not just thrown in there.
That's right.
It's not thrown in there to sort of fill in the gaps. Like, everything there is there for a very specific purpose.
Yeah. No, I think that that's true. If we start with the outline,
Yeah, sure.
yeah, look, out of all of the choices we've got, what do you think would be the most promising for a student to incorporate here?
The most promising influences. I think
Yeah.
you're probably, like I said before, looking at maybe ethical and corporate social responsibility. I think would be a big one. And because you're looking at a larger automated factory, I'll probably look at technology as the
Yeah,
other
okay.
as the other influence. Basically, moving away from labor towards manual, human resources, moving towards technology instead. I think they'll be the two big ones. How about yourself?
Well, I was wondering about globalization. And I think that there's probably not as much to hook it on as the CSR and technology that you've outlined. Because if I think about what is the influence of globalization here, well, that there's demand for their product.
Yeah,
What else? Like I just don't see it as being something else to discuss
Yeah.
in more detail. I also wondered about with either legal regulation or legal compliance and ethical responsibility with the redundancies. That if you're going to be sacking a whole bunch of people and replacing them with machines, could there be an argument that one influence is that the company needs to do the right thing legally and ethically
Yeah.
to kind of maintain its reputation?
Yeah, no, I didn't even think of that one there. That again, that's a great way of looking at it.
Right.
Yeah.
But I also think that for students, we understand that this is their first draft on an unseen question.
Yeah.
Right. So we have seen this question before.
Yeah.
We have thought about this question before our chat
Yeah.
now. So we have had some time. But even if you're thinking about factory automation, that sounds like technology, right?
Yeah.
Then that's a really good place to start. And then sustainably safe, bunch of redundancies. Okay, that sounds like legal and ethical involvement as well.
Yeah.
In terms of discussing those influences, is there a kind of structure or approach that you recommend for students in the report
And
setting?
how they should look. It is an outline, so it is quite.
Yeah.
I mean, quite a lower order set of thinking, I guess here. And I know we'll get into how would you structure and lay out the business report a little bit later on.
Mm.
But this would be a great sort of chance to sort of mention that in you want to. In your marking criteria, those three, and this is something I drill into my students all the time. Those three golden words are sustained, logical, and cohesive.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
for me, if you have an outline that is long as or longer than, say, a discuss or a recommend, for example, which are much higher order, then to
Mm.
me, that's not really a logical or sustained response because they're much, the level of detail and the level of thought you need to be putting in there are vastly different. So I wouldn't go overboard here with outlining the two influences. I'll put in what they are and how they influence the business, but there's no need to sort of go into too much detail here. I think. And
So what if we took the idea of
yeah,
technology? What you like? So we would say that the influence of technology is that the company is planning to buy an automated factory
yeah,
which would make sure the processes and production takes place without human involvement, without the need for staff.
yeah,
That would involve a reduction in staff numbers
yeah.
and a large investment to buy the factory. Would there be anything else that we might include in that kind of discussion?
And it really depends as well if you wanted to sort of link in different. I don't know, it's only an outline. If you wanted to
Yeah,
link in the issue of it being it's a safe, safe products where they're able to create, the technology will allow them to create or continue to create quality and defect free.
yeah.
Now that there's a reduction in human resources, you might now be able to have a much more sort of streamlined and quality product, I guess.
So that you remove some of the human
Human
element, which
error,
removes
a
the
human,
risk.
yeah,
Yeah, right.
yeah, yeah. I
No,
think
that
that
makes.
that's quite doable. I think.
But it's not like it's not like a huge section
No,
of this report in terms of this part.
no. Look, personally, with an outline, I'd say this will be quite short. It's kind of like when they ask you to describe,
Yeah.
something really quickly. You wouldn't be putting, you wouldn't be doing, two paragraphs, three paragraphs, or anything like this. This should be something relatively short. I mean, still detailed enough that you're answering the question, but I don't think it needs to be that long.
So that you could essentially do a paragraph for each of the influences.
Pretty much, I think so. Yeah,
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 I don't disagree. I agree with that. If we move on to that next part, so the next dot point, discuss the use of retraining and redundancy payments to help overcome employee resistance to these
yeah,
changes. What I like about this is it doesn't rely on the student knowing the syllabus, just like in a memorization
yeah,
activity. It does require the student to know the content, but it's not saying, discuss one method of overcoming
yeah,
resistance. It's saying discuss these specific things to overcome resistance. If I think about it, something that I think I would be inclined to discuss first would be what is the resistance to start with, right? And that I would think about talking about that the company's got an automated factory, reduces the need for labor, results in redundancies. Employees will resist this if
Yeah.
they're going to lose their jobs and their livelihood. I don't know, like sometimes I say things like this to students and they're like, but isn't this obvious? And I think that if you're able to explain the process of why the change, why resistance arises because of these changes, I think it does show a level of understanding.
Yeah. Yeah. And obviously, because this is a much higher order with the discuss, you're able to do that a little bit more
Yeah.
in depth as well, as opposed to just an outline like we had before, really. Because now you need to
What,
actually say what are the points for and or against this
yeah.
issue, which means you need to talk about why they've got that resistance in the first place.
And that if when that discussing that pros and cons, would you do the pros and cons each of retraining and redundancy separately, or would you do it as a kind of group altogether?
Look, I don't know about you, but personally, I've got no. Personally, as I said on my students, personally, I've got no preference as long as it's consistent all the way through, because
Yeah.
that then affects that cohesiveness that we spoke about before. With is a sustained, logical, and cohesive. If you have one paragraph and say this is the pros and or cons of retraining, and then you have here's redundancy pros, here's another paragraph of redundancy cons, and then you have another. That's not cohesive anymore. So if you're going to stick to
Yeah. Okay.
one way of doing it, and then do it the same way both times, basically. Um, I don't think there'll be any reason why doing it one way or the other would affect the way you're saying it. I think it will affect any
Mm.
marks, or will affect the way you're explaining it. As long as it's done consistently, I don't see. I don't know about you. What would you recommend?
I think I'm with you. I'm like I wouldn't be too fussed as long as it was consistent because if you treated them as one big thing and you said, well, the point of training and redundancy is to soften the impact of losing your job, give you financial support, and help you get the next job. I don't mind if you discuss it as a big thing or separately,
Yeah,
right? But then it would be talking about what are the pros of redundancy and retraining?
yeah,
What are the cons of doing those kind of things, right? So I agree with you. I'm not so fussed about that as long as it is consistent. If you break down one separately, break down the other separately,
yeah,
and don't address one and not the other
yeah.
as well. And I think that the pros and cons part is good because both of them involve extra money,
Exactly. Yeah,
right? So a con of offering retraining and redundancy is that even though you're trying to save money by cutting employees, you actually have to increase expenses
yeah.
in order to manage that process.
But this is focusing more on the employee side as opposed to the employer. So regardless of the cost, I don't think the employee would really. But the way the question's being asked, I think that it doesn't really matter how much it's going to cost.
And I think that you've shown me up in that part as well, right? Because you've gone back. No, but you've gone back and you've said, no, it's about overcoming employee resistance, right? And that I think that that's an important thing is what is the perspective of the dot point on the stimulus?
Yeah,
Are we looking at it from the company? Are we looking at it from the employee? So here you're thinking about that in terms of those things. If you're thinking about the cons of retraining and redundancy from employees, are there things that would stand out to you aside from the obvious of losing their jobs?
well, look, in terms of what other things could they? Why look? Whenever you do this and you ask kids what's the reason for resisting change, 9 times out of 10 they just shout out inertia because that's the one they remember the most. Because they hear it in science through year 7 through to 10 all the time, and then
Right.
so I think they always mention psychological and inertia. I think as the reasons. Look, I mean, look, why else will they, other than losing their job? I don't think the scenario gives you anything else to really
Yeah,
use.
that's
It's
right.
it's very tight what they're asking.
Yeah.
There's no sort of like not like the outline that's operations influence. I think this one's very specific, and like you said, it's not a syllabus remembering one. This is you've got to know your content, which is good because it means you're applying your content.
Mm.
But I think they've made it very, very narrow here, which means that if you can't remember this bit in the first place, then you can't sort of go off on a tangent.
No, that's right. So that yeah, it is that kind of idea from looking thinking back to the syllabus and be like, yes, inertia is something that
Yeah,
we would discuss in terms of why you would use these things. But I guess it's a bit tricky to think about the cons of using retraining and redundancy.
yeah.
Like, is discuss a helpful directive term for this part?
Well, yeah, exactly. So, what other would there be any cons of like
Like, what do you?
for the employee? I mean, other than that, it's going to take them time to retrain. I guess, like they're
Yeah,
going to waste time retraining. That could be again. That's a bit of a straight. That's a very tenuous link to make.
yeah. I
It's going to
guess
take
it's the
time. They might
sense,
need to, they might be of an age where they might not find the benefit of
right?
retraining. Maybe I don't know. That's a very hard one. Yeah,
It's a hard one, but maybe it is the sense that, okay, yes, the pro is that you get trained in your occupation and you get money,
yeah,
but maybe the cons are the money doesn't cover what the wages were, or you're being retrained for something that you're not really as suited
yeah,
for. But like you said, that is a bit of a kind of interpretation part of thing here.
yeah,
But maybe it isn't even that complicated that you're thinking about, okay, so the company's offering these for employees. What are the pros and cons of this kind of approach?
yeah,
And maybe that the pros exceed the cons. And that's something as well that students will ask me a lot. Is it okay to have three pros and one con?
yeah,
And it's like, if that's what the story is, then reflect the story. You're not going to make up something that doesn't
yeah.
exist just to even up the numbers.
Yeah, and I think even Nessa in their their definition of what this is, it's just and or. So you can do all
Yeah.
pros
Okay.
if you wanted to, or all cons if you
Right.
wanted to. I don't think they really. I don't think even they would have any concern of you have to balance out because if you like you said if you can't balance it, you're not going to make stuff up just for the sake of
for,
having balance.
well, that's right. Because if you have three great pros and five stretch cons, then the marker is just going to ignore the stuff that you've tried to make fit.
Yeah,
Right?
exactly.
You're not losing marks, but you're definitely not gaining anything
Yeah.
there.
And the fact you've got 35 minutes to write an unseen
Oh
response,
gosh, I
you've
know,
wasted
right?
probably 10, 15 minutes making something up.
Yeah. No, I think that's fair. Um, so that's kind of the approach that we would focus
Yeah,
on there. And if it's mostly pros, mostly what it would be helpful with, then go with that
yeah.
for sure. Let's look at the last
Mhm.
part. Compare the use of a mortgage to a new issue of shares to fund the factory purchase. What I think would be good is that in looking at this with students, is to get them in somewhere conspicuous in their notes to write down new issue of shares linked to IPO, initial
Yeah,
listing of the company, right? Going public. So that rather than getting confused with the many different forms of equity, new
yeah,
issues, rights issues,
yeah,
placements, share purchase plans, if you're thinking new issues never existed before, that would be a perspective to take.
yeah, yeah. And they've made it very specific by choosing new issues as opposed to just saying ordinary shares in general or anything
Right.
like that as well.
So if you are going to compare debt
Yeah.
versus equity, essentially what this is asking, would you be inclined to come up with a recommendation, do you think, at the end of this section here?
Look, this is something that my students always sort of battle with as well is
Yeah.
unless it says to recommend, for me, don't waste your time recommending unless it actually specifically says recommend. It
Okay.
it all the question says compare. It doesn't say recommend anything.
Yeah.
It just says what's basically what's a mortgage and what's a new issue share. That's it. There's no which one would you choose. It's just what are the two options available, basically. Um, I don't know. I wouldn't recommend. Would you have them recommend?
No, I wouldn't either because I'm not being asked. And that if I see this question, um, I would hope that the students would see that they could cheer because it's a relatively simple look
Mm,
at what are the pros and cons of debt versus equity,
yeah,
right? If the company takes out a mortgage, here are the benefits, but here are the
Yeah.
disadvantages. Next paragraph. If a company issues new shares, which would involve listing on the securities exchange, as was in the stimulus,
Yep.
here are the good things, here are the bad things,
Yep.
which seems odd that a business would commission someone to compare things,
Yep.
but that's not our job
Yep.
in answering this question, right?
Oh, look, a lot of the times I get questions all from students saying this doesn't make sense. Like, no, Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson aren't gonna, they're gonna run. Like, well, you're not writing it for Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson. You're writing something to pass a Stage 6 NESA course that hasn't been updated since 2011, mind you. You're playing a game. You're not writing an actual business report. This is what NESA wants you to do. So yeah, a real business isn't going to ask you to compare a debt to equity, but
That's what it is,
this is
right?
what it is.
And so I think that if I'm thinking about compare in this context, that I might say, why use debt?
Yeah,
And then why use equity?
yeah,
Right? And that would be what it would be. I think that it would be useful having a preamble to say, what would a mortgage involve in purchasing the factory?
mhm,
Right? You are borrowing money from the bank, you are getting the cash, but you are making repayments, that kind of stuff. What does it mean to issue shares? Okay, you're listing on the exchange, you are getting capital inflow, but you are diluting the equity of the existing owners.
yeah, exactly.
Like make it clear to the marker that you actually know what the content is
Yeah,
before you compare how they work.
yeah, exactly. You've got to make sure you get your content across first, more before you can start doing anything else. And
But
then this is the fine balance of the report, is then also making sure you're interweaving the stimulus throughout and constantly referring back to the stimulus throughout this whole thing as well. So it is a fine balancing act.
if you're laying out
Yeah.
the business report, what would it kind of look like section by section for you?
Um, Look, obviously, always start with, and I can't stress this enough. Always start with the words "executive summary" at the start of your report. The amount of students that don't start with that automatically means that you're not using a proper report format according to the guidelines, because you haven't, two simple words, you haven't included executive summary at the top. And I don't mind about numbering. Like, I don't, if they use numbers or if they just sort of like indent a little bit, like, a little fill
Yeah.
space before they do the next thing, as long as it's consistent as well, of what they're trying to do. But I'd have executive summary. Um, Start with your operations influences. Now, I like to include like a little sentence underneath the main heading before they go into the
Yeah.
subheadings, just so the marker knows what they're sort of going to be reading about. And it's not a paragraph, just literally one sentence. So, like a generic operations influences, influences that impact on the processes within a business's manufacturing, or whatever you want to say, such as, and then say what your two are, and then go influence one, influence two, and then follow that through. Put a little sentence before you go into your sub paragraphs, which you should mention in your executive summary as well. Like 1-2 sentences to
Yeah.
talk about your stimulus. If you just rewrite it, you've wasted time and you don't get anything out of it. One sentence. Aussie Baby, what's it called? Aussie Baby Food Pizza Boy Ltd. Are considering purchasing a larger automated factory. However, are faced with potential job losses. This report will, and then put outline two operations influences, such as, and then I reckon I like mine to put down what they're going to talk about in the summary. That
Yeah.
that way
Same.
they know what the marker knows then what the subheadings are going to be, and then that helps with their cohesiveness and the logic behind it. Because if you say you're going to talk about globalization, then I should be able to see globalization somewhere as a subheading in your report then as well.
I think that that's a really good point, because the way you're saying it, that the executive summary doesn't need to restate the first three lines of this
Mm,
stimulus, right? That Aussie Baby Food know that they've got a trusted reputation. They know that they've got a safe and sustainably sourced product range.
yeah,
Why? Because they gave you this information,
yeah,
right? What do they really care about? They care about, what do we do about this factory purchase?
yeah.
And so I like your point about, what are kind of like the highlights? And then in relation to that, what are the things are you actually going to discuss under each heading in the next sections of the report?
Yeah, exactly. That's I
So
mean,
we
that's how I'd approach it. I'm
I
not
agree
sure.
with you.
What's that? Sorry.
Yeah, no, I
Oh yeah,
agree. I think that to have the idea that you've got operations influences. Operations influences are these things in this report. These two influences will be discussed, and then here is influence one, influence two,
yeah,
linked back to the stimulus, right? And then maybe your next section is how overcoming resistance to change in operations. Okay, resistance to change involves this for Aussie experiencing resistance from staff, blah blah blah. Here are the things that will be discussed.
yeah. Yeah, I think that because that way it gives the marker a chance that you're not just sort of not you would make anything up, but you're not sort of um, just throwing it in there because you can't think of anything else. If you've got those leading sentences, it shows the marker that you actually know more than what you're actually going to talk about because you are giving a
Yeah.
bit more context about what they all are. This is when you've got the chance to say, overcoming resistance to change, maybe throw in a few things you're not going to talk about because you're giving a broad overview of what that resistance might be before you go into the two specific ones.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And just in terms of the structure as well, is that I encourage students to use numbers. There's no, like, you're not going to
Well,
get
no.
extra marks for it, but it's just like, for me, the way that I would set it up, for example, is the executive summary would have no numbers.
Yeah.
And then operations influence that'd be 1.0, influence one would be 1.2, influence two 1.2, and so on. But either way, whether it's a space, an indentation, something, just to show how you are separating out the sections of the report.
Yeah. As long as it's
Something,
consistent,
sorry,
that's it.
yeah, something that I struggle a bit with, and that students are never quite satisfied with my responses. How would you end a business report? Do you have a conclusion? Do you have key recommendations? Does it all depend? How do you tend to approach this?
Look, I think it depends on the question. If you got and this is where as well is when you do a report, there's sort of two streams you can sort of go down depending if it asks you if there's a recommendation where you can either do like if this asks for a recommend, you could have gone content recommendation, or
Right.
all the content and the recommendation at the end as your two options. Because this has got no recommendation, I think you can just finish off with do a conclusion at the end, which again, if you're running out of time, you've got 35 minutes, you can probably do without.
Yeah.
I'd rather students not have a conclusion if they ran out of time than not have an executive summary. I think that's vastly more important. Even though I tell mine to write their executive summary last or towards the end, because by that stage, for an unseen piece at least, if you're doing a research task at home and you've got plenty of time, then by all means do your summary first. But if you're running out of time, then sorry. If you're doing this sort of under time conditions, sorry, and it's an unseen, I recommend doing your executive summary towards the end because that way you know what you know what you've spoken about before you
Yeah.
actually There's nothing worse I find. It doesn't cost you marks, but it's nothing worse than writing a summary and then having crossed out because you're going to change your mind because you talk about something different. Or
Yeah.
then, so I'd rather talk about what you want to talk about and then do your summary afterwards, because then you know what you're going to talk about because you just spoke about it. But conclusion, I just go straight to conclusion, 2 or 3 sentences. This is what I spoke about. There's no need to make a recommendation in this case, I don't think.
No, I think I like your approach that with the executive summary, I encourage students to leave half a page,
Yeah,
right, before they start writing, so that, do it last, come back to it. And I think it's also challenging for students to say to them, which is what I often say, is that your conclusion should be guided by the nature of the question, right? Like you said very clearly, there is nothing that you have been asked to provide a recommendation here. So if you have a structure as a student where you're like, my conclusion will always be key recommendations, then you will struggle here because there are no key
yeah,
recommendations. So what I might do here is kind of like a little bit of an English conclusion, which is like, here are some of the key things that I've discussed,
yeah,
right? Because you've been asked to discuss, compare, and outline. And like you're saying, that the thing that should always go when you're running out of time in a business report is the conclusion.
Yeah.
You've got an executive summary, which is like a conclusion at the start.
Yeah.
You've got the sections. If you don't get to the conclusion, this will not hurt how you perform here.
Yeah. Yeah. And don't start with in sum. Don't start with to elucidate is a good one as well.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's a great one.
Just a very simple in conclusion, or you can even start off with Ozzi Baby Food Pty Ltd. You know,
Is affected by the
affected
operations
by
influences by these
Yeah.
things, that it is looking at the use of redundancy and retraining
Yeah.
payments to overcome resistance, and that there are, that these are the kind of the things that they should consider in thinking about mortgages and new share issues.
Yeah.
I also get like the students are back being third speaker in debating, saying, as I have so conclusively
Yeah.
said, or as I have
Yeah.
so convincingly written, and
Yeah.
I said I might beg to differ on this one. Just keep it real simple, because if you think about who's paying you to write this, that they just want the information
Yeah.
really quick and upfront.
Yeah. Exactly. And that's why you do your executive summary. That's why that has to be very tight, because that's generally what the very first thing they're going to, in the real world, what they look at.
Yeah.
So just, like you said, conclusion you can do without. It's an executive summary that you should really, really focus on, as opposed to your conclusion if you're running out of time, I think.
And I guess that I would also say is that all the people watching this, don't yell at us if your teacher has different advice or information, right?
Well,
Like,
yeah.
be guided by what they're suggesting to you, what makes sense to you, that this is not some kind of band 6 every
Yeah.
time video. What
Yeah.
we're just saying to you is to think about what the question is asking you
Yeah.
and what makes sense to include, really.
Yeah, this is all personal, personal preference,
That's
personal
right.
opinion. You'll find NESA doesn't even have a set way of writing a report. There's no one right way of writing a business report according to NESA. As long as you're consistent in what you do and you're answering your questions, I can't see why, there'll be other ways to do this that won't be as effective. So yeah, do what your teacher guides you to do. That's fine, as long as you're consistent in your approach. That I can't see what can go wrong.
Well, we might leave this one there. So thanks for your time, Marco, and thanks everyone for watching, and we'll catch you in the next one.
Thank you.